Hello there and welcome. Settle in wherever you are and let the room grow a little softer around you. Tonight we're not going to hurry anywhere. We're going to follow water. Not the water in a glass beside your bed, and not the rain that might be falling somewhere outside your window, but water far older than either. Water that has been moving across the surface of this planet for longer than there has been anyone to watch it. We're going to follow the rivers, the long silver threads that wind across continents, and we're going to ask a quiet question that most of us never think to ask. Why is it that almost everywhere, people first gathered into cities, first wrote things down, first built walls and temples and counted the days, they did it beside a river? It's a curious thing when you stop to consider it. We tend to imagine that civilization began with an idea, a spark of cleverness in someone's mind, a sudden decision to build. But the truth is gentler and stranger than that. Civilization began with a place. It began at the edge of moving water, on the banks of a few great rivers scattered across the world. And the story of how those rivers shaped us is one we are rarely told in full. We learn the names of kings and the dates of battles, but the river that fed them, the river that made them possible, usually slips by unnoticed, the way a river itself slips past a sleeping town in the dark. Before we drift further in, I wonder where you're listening from tonight. Is it late where you are? The world outside already gone quiet? The lights low? Or is it some gray hour of the morning, the day not yet decided? Wherever you are, you're probably nearer to a river than you think. Most cities were placed beside one, long ago, by people whose names we've forgotten. If you find this slow kind of wandering soothing, you might gently leave a like, or even subscribe, so that more of these calm journeys can find their way to people like you, looking for somewhere quiet to rest their minds. But only if it feels right. There's no hurry here. There's no hurry anywhere in this story. So let your breathing slow, and let your thoughts loosen, and come with me back to a time before there were any cities at all. Imagine the earth as it was, tens of thousands of years ago, long before the first wall was raised. The continents are roughly where you'd expect them, but everything upon them is wild. There are no fields, no roads, no harbors, and across this untamed world, the rivers are already running, exactly as they run now, carrying rain down from the mountains, gathering the meltwater of distant snows, threading through valleys they themselves have carved over unimaginable spans of time. The rivers are older than us by far. They were here before we arrived, and in a sense, they were waiting. Think for a moment about what a river actually is, beneath the simple word we use for it. A river is the planet's way of moving water from high places to low ones, but it is also something more. It is a sculptor, patient beyond patience, wearing away stone, one grain at a time. It is a carrier, lifting tiny particles of soil from one place and laying them down in another. And it is a giver, because everywhere it floods and recedes, it leaves behind a gift, a thin, dark layer of silt, the ground-up richness of distant lands, spread across the low fields like a blessing no one asked for and no one fully understood. Consider for a moment just how long a river has been at this work, and how slowly and how surely it shapes the very land it runs through. For this is a thing worth resting the mind upon, the sheer deep patience of moving water. Every valley a great river flows through, it carved itself, not in a year or a lifetime or 1,000 lifetimes, but across spans of time so vast that the human mind can barely hold them, the water cutting down, grain by grain, age by age, until what was once a high plain became a deep valley, until what was once solid rock became a gorge, with the river running far below at the bottom of cliffs of its own making. A river does not merely flow across the land. Over long enough time, the river makes the land, wearing down the mountains and carrying them, a particle at a time, down toward the sea, and building, at its lower end, whole new country out of the mud it brings, spreading its delta further and further into the sea over the ages, raising fresh land where once there was only water. The very ground that the first farmers broke with their wooden tools, That flat, soft, fertile floor on either side of the channel was land the river had made, sediment it had carried down from far away and laid down patiently over uncounted floods, building the stage on which the whole human drama would later play. And the river wanders as it works, swinging slowly back and forth across its plain, curving into great looping bends, abandoning old channels and cutting new ones, so that a river is never quite still, even when it seems most settled, always, on the scale of centuries, moving, restless, alive. To watch a river is to watch the slowest and most powerful artist in the world at work, an artist who carved the valleys and built the plains and laid the soil long before there was anyone to farm it, and who is working still, this very night, wherever water moves toward the sea. That silt is one of the things you were never told. We picture rivers as lines of water, but the truly important thing about a great river is not the water, it's what the water carries. Every flood that ever frightened a farmer was also feeding him. The brown, muddy, swollen river that overflowed its banks and drowned the low ground was, at the very same moment, depositing across that ground a fresh layer of the most fertile soil on earth. Year after year, flood after flood, the river renewed the land for free, doing the work that would otherwise exhaust the soil and break the people who farmed it. This is the secret at the heart of every river civilization. They did not simply live beside water. They lived beside a machine that rebuilt their fields each year, and they slowly, over many lifetimes, learned to read it. But long before any of that, before farming, before fields, the first people came to the rivers for the simplest reasons of all. They came to drink. They came because the animals came, the herds gathering at the water's edge at dawn and dusk, and where the herds gathered, the hunters followed. They came because along the banks, in the damp and the green, grew plants that bore seeds and roots and fruit. Rivers were the gathering places of the old world, the meeting points of everything that lived. To stand at a river was to stand where life concentrated itself, and our distant ancestors, wandering in small bands across enormous empty distances, learned to find these threads of water and to follow them, the way you might follow a familiar path home in the dark, trusting your feet more than your eyes. Imagine one of those early camps, set on a low rise above a river bend, far back in the deep past. The fire has burned down to embers. The people are sleeping, much as you are settling now, and around them the night is full of sound, the soft, endless murmur of the water sliding past in the dark, the call of something in the reeds, the wind moving through the trees along the bank. They do not think of themselves as the beginning of anything. They are simply alive, beside the water, as their parents were, and their parents before them. And yet, in choosing again and again to stay near the river, they were laying down the first faint groove of a path that would lead, over thousands of years, to everything we now call the world. For a very long time, nothing much changed. People followed the herds and the seasons, and the rivers ran on, indifferent, beautiful, doing what they had always done. But somewhere, in a handful of places, something began to shift. The ice that had gripped much of the world began to loosen. The climate softened and steadied, and in the warm, well-watered valleys where the great rivers spread out into the flat lowlands, the wild grasses grew thick and heavy with seed. People who had always gathered those seeds began, without quite deciding to favor the best of them, to scatter a few back into the soft riverside earth, to return to the same patch the following year, to see what had grown. It was not an invention. There was no single morning when someone thought of farming. It was a slow leaning, a gradual settling, a turning toward the soil that took many generations and that no one alive at the time would have recognized as a revolution. And it happened beside rivers, because beside rivers it could. The seeds needed water, and the river was water. The soil needed renewing, and the flood renewed it. The growing plants needed flat, soft, workable ground, and the river, over its long, patient life, had laid down exactly that, a broad floor of fine sediment, stretching out on either side of its channel, free of stones, easy to break with the simplest of tools, everything the first farmers needed. The river had already prepared, long before they arrived, asking nothing in return except that they learn its moods, where it would rise, and when, how high, how long the water would stand, where it would fall again, leaving the fresh, dark mud behind. To farm a river was to enter into a kind of conversation with it, a conversation conducted in floods and seasons, and the people who learned that conversation best became the people who stayed. Imagine, then, one of those first small farming villages, set on a low rise above the river, in the early days of this great turning. It is little more than a cluster of houses built of mud and reed, their walls the color of the earth they stand on, their roofs woven from the tall reeds that grow in the marshes along the water. Smoke rises from cooking fires, children play at the edge of the fields, and all around, in the fertile soil the river has laid down, the grain is growing, ordered now, planted by human hands, watered by the channels those hands have cut. This is a new kind of place in the world, a settled place, a place people stay, a place that grows year by year as the fields feed more mouths, and more mouths work more fields. The wandering is ending here, on the riverbank, and something is beginning that has no name yet. And out of the grain that the river grew came the two things that, more than almost anything else, would feed the first civilizations, and one of them may surprise you. The first, of course, is bread, the ground grain mixed with water and baked on a hot stone or in the ashes of the fire, the simple loaf that has fed human beings ever since. But the second is something you are rarely told about, and it may have mattered just as much. It is beer, for when grain is left to soak and ferment, it makes not only food but drink, a thick, nourishing, mildly intoxicating brew, and the people of the river plains made it in great quantities and drank it daily, men and women and even children, for it was safer than the river water, and it was food as much as drink, and it gathered people together in pleasure and in ceremony. Some have even wondered, looking at how central beer was to these first societies, whether the desire for it might have been one of the quiet reasons people first bothered to grow grain at all. Whether or not that is so, the river grew the grain, and the grain made the bread and the beer, and the bread and the beer fed the people who built the world. The river gave more than grain. Along its banks grew the reeds, tall and green and endlessly useful, and the people learned to cut them and bind them and weave them into 1,000 things, into baskets and mats and the walls and roofs of their houses, and, most wonderfully, into boats. Picture a boat made wholly of reeds, bundles of them lashed tightly together, light and buoyant, curving up at the ends, gliding across the water as easily as a leaf, carrying a fisherman and his nets out among the marshes. The river gave the reed, and the reed gave the boat, and the boat gave the people the freedom of the water, the ability to move along the great road the river offered. And from the same fine river clay that the people pressed into tablets to write upon, they shaped pots and jars and vessels of every kind, hardened in the fire, to store the grain and carry the water and brew the beer and hold the oil. The humble pottery, that is, to those who study these things, one of the surest signs that a settled people lived in a place, the broken shards of it lying scattered in the earth long after everything else has gone. Reed and clay and grain and water, all of it the gift of the river, all of it the raw material out of which a new way of living was slowly, patiently assembled beside the moving water in the long, warm mornings of the early world. Let us go now to one of the very first places where that conversation was learned, a place so old that it sits at the foundation of much of what came after. Imagine a wide, hot, flat land lying between two great rivers, somewhere in the heart of what we now call the Middle East. The two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the land between them was given a name by people who came much later, a name that means simply that, the land between the rivers. We call it Mesopotamia. It is one of the places where, as far as we can tell, cities were truly born. Picture it as it was, perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. The two rivers come down out of the northern mountains, swollen with snowmelt, and they spill across a vast lowland plain on their long way to the sea. In the spring they rise, sometimes gently, sometimes violently, and they flood the flat land, and then they fall again and leave behind that gift of silt. The plain is fertile beyond anything the people have known. But here is something you were never told, and it matters. This land was not an easy paradise. The Nile, far to the west, floods with a kind of reliable rhythm, but the Tigris and the Euphrates are wilder, harder to predict, prone to rising at the wrong time, prone to changing their course entirely, prone to drowning a season's work without warning. And the rain, away from the rivers, is scarce. Beyond the reach of the water, the land bakes and cracks. So the people who settled here faced a strange double truth. They had been given the richest soil imaginable, and they had been given it on the banks of two of the most temperamental rivers in the world, in the middle of a land that, without those rivers, would be desert. What they did in response is one of the quiet miracles of human history. They began to dig, not deeply at first, just small channels to lead the water from the river out across the fields, to bring it to the grain when the grain needed it, rather than waiting helplessly for the flood. And once they had dug one channel, the logic of it pulled them onward. A channel could be lengthened, it could be branched, it could carry water to land that the flood itself never reached, turning dry ground green. The river, which had given so much already, could be persuaded to give more, if only enough hands worked together to guide it. And so, slowly, the people of the plain became diggers of canals, builders of dikes, keepers of water, and in becoming so, they became something else as well. They became a society that had to cooperate, because a canal is not the work of one family. It is the work of many, and it must be maintained year after year, cleared of silt, repaired after floods, defended against the season when the river runs low and there is not enough water to go around. Here, in the mud and the heat, you can watch a city forming almost as a side effect of managing water. When many families must work together to control a river, someone must organize that work. Someone must decide whose field gets water first when the channel runs low. Someone must keep account of who contributed labor and who did not, who owes a share of the harvest, who has taken more than their due, and to keep such accounts. In a world where there were as yet no books and no writing, the people of Mesopotamia did a thing so ordinary and so world-changing that it still astonishes. They began to press small marks into wet clay. Imagine that. The same soft river mud that grew the grain became the surface on which the first writing in the world was made. A scribe takes a lump of damp clay, smooths it flat with his hand, and with the cut end of a reed, presses a series of small wedge-shaped marks into the surface, marks that record a number of measures of barley, a count of sheep, the name of a temple storehouse. The clay dries hard in the sun, and the record endures, far longer than the scribe who made it ever imagined, long enough that thousands of years later it can be lifted from the earth and read again. Writing, the very thing that lets a civilization remember itself, was born not from poetry or prayer, but from the simple need to keep track of grain and water and debt. And the grain and the water and the debt all came, in the end, from the river. These first cities of the river plain were unlike anything that had existed before. There was Uruk, perhaps the greatest of them, its walls enclosing tens of thousands of people, its temple rising above the flat land like a mountain made by hands, a great stepped platform of mud brick reaching toward the sky. There was Ur and Eridu, which the people themselves remembered as the oldest of all, the first city, the place where, in their stories, kingship first came down from the heavens. To walk through one of these cities at dusk would have been to move through narrow, shaded lanes between mud brick walls, past the doorways of houses, past workshops where potters and weavers and metalworkers labored, out toward the canals where boats came and went, loaded with grain and reeds and fish, and beyond the canals to the fields, green and ordered, drinking the river's water through the channels that human hands had cut. And all of it, every brick and every loaf and every clay tablet, rested on the river. The temple at the heart of the city was not only a place of worship, it was a storehouse, a granary, the institution that gathered in the surplus of the fields and redistributed it, that organized the labor of the canals, that kept the accounts in clay. The first great human institutions grew up around the management of the river's gift, and the people knew, in their way, that they owed everything to the water, for among the gods they honored was a god of the sweet waters, the deep fresh water beneath the earth and in the rivers, a wise and cunning god who was said to have given humankind the arts of civilization itself. When they thanked him, they were thanking the river in the only language they had. There is another gift that grew out of the river here, less visible than the canals or the cities, but woven just as deeply into everything that came after, and it is the gift of law. Think about what it means to share a river. When many families draw their water from the same channel, when the field of one man lies upstream of the field of another, when the flood may favor one village and ruin its neighbor, when the labor of clearing the canals must be shared and the harvest must be divided, then disputes are certain to arise, as certain as the rising of the water. Whose turn is it to take from the channel when the river runs low? Who is to blame when a poorly kept dike bursts and floods a neighbor's grain? How much of the harvest is owed to the temple, to the king, to the man who lent the seed? In a world of a few wandering families, such questions could be settled with a word or a quarrel. But in the crowded, ordered, interdependent world of the river plain, where everyone's life was bound up with everyone else's through the shared veins of the water, such questions had to be settled by something larger than any individual, by rules that stood above the people and applied to all of them alike, by law. And so, among these river peoples, there grew up some of the first written laws in the history of the world, codes of justice, carved in stone and pressed into clay, setting out what was permitted and what was forbidden, what penalty followed what offense, how disputes were to be judged and debts repaid and wrongs made right. The most famous of them, the great code gathered together by a king of Babylon and carved upon a tall pillar of black stone, has come down to us nearly whole, hundreds of laws ordering the life of the river society, and threaded all through it, woven into its very fabric, you can find the concerns of a people who lived by irrigation. There are laws about the dikes and the canals, laws that say if a man is careless with the bank of his field, and the water breaks through and floods his neighbor's land, then he must make good the grain that was lost. There are laws about the renting of fields and the lending of seed and the division of the harvest, laws about the boats that carried goods on the river and what was owed if one was wrecked or sank. The river ran through the law as surely as it ran through the land, for the law had grown up to manage exactly the conflicts that the river created, the eternal frictions of people sharing a single, precious, dangerous source of life. And to make such laws work, the people had to measure. They had to know exactly how large each field was, so that its harvest and its taxes could be reckoned. They had to mark the boundaries between one man's land and another's, for in a plain of fertile mud, where the flood could blur every edge, the question of where one field ended and the next began was a question of survival, and the moving of a boundary stone was among the gravest of crimes. They had to count the measures of grain that went into the storehouse and came out again, the days of labor owed and given, the shares and the debts and the dues. And so the river civilization became a civilization of measurement and number, of surveyors who reckoned the land and scribes who kept the count. And out of that long practical labor of measuring fields and dividing water and reckoning harvests grew the early roots of mathematics itself, of geometry and arithmetic, the patient counting and figuring that the management of the river demanded. We tend to imagine mathematics born in the minds of philosophers, but its first deep roots lie in the mud of the river plains, in the need to measure a flooded field and divide a shared water and reckon a fair tax. The river teaching the people to count, because beside the river, counting was a matter of bread and of justice. But the river never gives without taking, and this too is part of the story you are rarely told. The same irrigation that turned the desert green carried within it a slow poison. When you spread river water across flat, hot fields and let the sun draw it back up into the air, The water leaves behind something the river carried in tiny amounts, dissolved in itself, invisible. Salt. A little each year, far too little to notice in any single season. But over centuries, in fields watered again and again, with no way to flush the salt away, it accumulated in the soil, a faint white crust gathering at the surface, and the grain that had grown so richly began, slowly, to grow less well. The records from those ancient cities show it happening, show farmers turning from the wheat that the salt killed first to the barley that could endure a little more, show yields falling over the long generations as the very land that the river had made began, quietly, to fail. There is something almost unbearably human in this. The people of Mesopotamia did everything right. They worked together, they engineered the water, they fed great cities, they invented writing and law and the wheel and the measurement of time, and the cost of their triumph was hidden in the water itself, accumulating grain by grain, salt by salt, beneath their feet, in a process so slow that no one alive could see it, only the records, only the long view that we, looking back across the millennia, are able to take. The rivers that built the first civilization also, in the end, helped to wear it down, and the center of power drifted northward over the centuries, away from the oldest, saltiest land, toward fresher ground. The river gives, and the river takes, and it does both so slowly that we are often only able to understand it long afterward, lying awake in the dark, looking back. Let us leave the two rivers now and travel west, to a river so different in its temper that the people who lived beside it built a wholly different kind of world. Picture a long, narrow ribbon of green winding through an immense desert, a thread of life threaded through hundreds of miles of sand and stone. On either side of the green, the desert begins almost at once, sharp and total, so that a person could stand with one foot on black fertile soil and the other on lifeless sand. The green is the valley of the Nile, and the Nile is, in many ways, the gentlest and most generous river in the whole of this story. The Egyptians had a saying, recorded long ago, that their land was the gift of the river, and they were exactly right. More right, perhaps, than they knew. Without the Nile, the land of Egypt would be simply more desert, indistinguishable from the vast, dry emptiness that surrounds it on every side. There is almost no rain. The crops cannot drink from the sky, because the sky gives them nothing. Everything, every field of wheat, every grove of date palms, every blade of grass, drinks from the river, and only from the river. And the river, year after year, with a faithfulness that the Tigris and Euphrates never matched, came up out of its banks at the same season and spread its water and its silt across the valley floor, and then withdrew, leaving the fields soaked and renewed and ready for the seed. Imagine living within that rhythm. Each year, in the heart of summer, the Nile begins to rise. The people do not know, in the ancient world, why it rises, for the rains that swell it fall far to the south, in highlands and lakes that no Egyptian had ever seen. To them the rising is a mystery and a miracle, the river swelling of its own will, climbing higher day by day, spreading out across the low land, until the valley becomes, for a season, a shining sheet of water dotted with the islands of the higher villages. The fields vanish beneath the flood. The people wait, and then, as surely as it came, the water begins to fall, sinking back into its channel, leaving behind across the drowned land that same dark, rich, glistening layer of fresh silt, the ground-up fertility of the distant African highlands, delivered free to every farmer's door. You can feel, in this, why the Egyptians saw the world as fundamentally ordered and reliable in a way the Mesopotamians never quite could. Their river kept its promises. Its flood was a calendar you could set your life by, a great slow heartbeat that beat once a year, every year, for thousands of years. And out of that reliability grew a civilization of extraordinary stability and confidence, a civilization that endured, in recognizable form, for longer than almost any other in human history, that built in stone for eternity because it believed, with good reason, that the order of things would hold. The pyramids themselves, those vast and patient mountains of cut stone, are in a sense monuments to the river, for they were built by the surplus the river made. In the season when the flood covered the fields and the farmers, with nothing to farm, became builders instead, fed by the granaries that the river had filled. And here is something you were never told about those great works. We imagine them built by suffering multitudes, driven by the whip, but the better evidence suggests something closer to the truth of the river itself. When the Nile flooded and the fields lay under water, there was a season each year when the land could not be worked, when the farmers were idle but the food, stored from the harvest, remained. It was in that season, very likely, that the great building happened. The people gathered and fed and organized, lifting and shaping stone. In the months the river had freed them from the fields. The river not only fed the workers, it gave them the time. The pyramids rise from the rhythm of the flood as surely as the wheat did. Time itself, the very way we divide and count our days, owes a debt to this river that few of us ever consider. The Egyptians, watching the flood come round year after year, needed to know when it would come, and to know that they watched the sky as well as the water. They noticed that the great flood arrived each year at almost the same moment that a certain brilliant star, the one we call Sirius, first reappeared in the dawn sky after a season of absence, rising just ahead of the sun. By counting the days between one such rising and the next, they arrived at a year of 365 days, and they divided that year and the cycle of the flood into seasons and months. The river taught them to measure time, the calendar that orders your own life. The very notion of a year of a fixed number of days descends in part from people standing on a riverbank long ago, watching for a star and waiting for the water to rise. They measured the river itself as well, with a quiet, practical genius. Along the Nile, at certain places, they built what we call nilometers, simple structures, often a flight of steps or a marked column descending into the water, on which the height of the rising flood could be read. And this was no idle curiosity. The height of the flood foretold the harvest. A high flood meant the water would reach far across the land and the harvest would be great. A low flood meant some fields would go dry and hunger might follow. A flood too high might drown the villages and sweep away the dikes. So the officials read the river the way a doctor reads a pulse, and from its height they reckoned how much grain the land would yield, and from that they reckoned the taxes, the share of the harvest the state would take. The river was measured, and from its measurement flowed not only food, but the entire apparatus of government. The granaries, the scribes, the officials, the king himself, who was held responsible, in some deep symbolic sense, for the river's faithfulness, whose duty it was to keep the cosmic order by which the flood returned. To rule Egypt was, at the deepest level, to be answerable for the river. Stand for a moment, in your imagination, on the bank of the Nile at evening. 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, the flood has receded. The fields are green with new growth, divided into neat plots by low banks of earth. Boats move on the river, their sails catching the last light, carrying grain downstream and stone upstream, for the river was the great road of Egypt, the highway down which everything traveled. The current carries you north toward the sea, and the steady north wind carries you south against the current, so that the river, almost uniquely, was a road that ran easily in both directions, and the whole long land was bound together by it into a single thing. Without the Nile, Egypt would not merely have been poorer, it would not have been Egypt at all. It would have been a scattering of unconnected oases in a sea of sand. The river made it one. And there is a part of the Nile's gift that is easy to overlook, far in the north, where the long river at last grew tired of its narrow valley and spread out, in its final reach, into a great fan of branching channels and marshes before it met the sea, the wide green triangle of land we call the delta. Here the single river became many, dividing and dividing again, threading through a vast wetland of reeds and pools and slow brown water, teeming with life. This was, in its way, the richest part of all, a place of fish beyond counting, and birds in their thousands. of papyrus growing in dense green thickets taller than a person. And the people of the marshes lived a life half on land and half on water, poling their light boats through the channels, casting their nets, snaring the wild fowl that rose in great clouds from the reeds. To drift through the delta marshes at dawn would have been to move through a world of soft mist and bird song, and the gentle parting of reeds, the water everywhere, the land barely holding its own against it, a place of abundance, so easy and so generous that it seemed the river was simply pouring out its gifts at the end of its long journey, holding nothing back. And from those marshes came one gift in particular that changed the world far beyond Egypt, a gift hidden in the tall green reed called papyrus. For the Egyptians learned to take the stem of that reed, to cut it into thin strips, to lay the strips crosswise and press them and dry them, and so to make a smooth, pale sheet that could be written upon and rolled up and carried and stored, the first true paper, light and portable in a way that heavy clay tablets could never be. Upon these sheets of pressed river reed, the Egyptians wrote their records and their letters, their stories and their prayers and their knowledge, and the sheets could be joined into long rolls and gathered into the first libraries, the accumulated memory of a people held in rolls of dried marsh reed. The very word we use for paper descends, across thousands of years and many tongues, from the name of that Egyptian reed, so that something of the Nile's marshes lives on, quietly, in every page you have ever turned, in every book and every letter, the river reaching forward across the millennia through the humble green stem it grew in its delta, to become the surface on which much of human memory was kept. Now we journey east again, far to the east, beyond the lands we have visited, to a river whose civilization is perhaps the most mysterious of all the great river cultures, a people who built cities of remarkable sophistication, and then, for reasons we still cannot fully explain, faded from history, leaving behind a written language that to this day no one has been able to read. This is the valley of the Indus, in the lands we now call Pakistan and northwestern India, and the civilization that grew there is one of the things you were almost certainly never told much about, though it stood among the very greatest of the ancient world. The Indus comes down from the high mountains, fed by snow and by the great seasonal rains of the monsoon, and like the Nile and the rivers of Mesopotamia, it spread fertility across a broad plain, and on that plain, 4,500 years ago and more, there arose cities so well planned, so clean, so carefully built, that when their ruins were first uncovered in modern times, the people who found them could scarcely believe their age. The greatest of them, which we call Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, for we do not know the names their own people used, were laid out on a grid, their streets running straight and crossing at right angles, divided into neat blocks, in a way that would not look out of place in a planned city of much more recent times. This was no haphazard tangle of lanes. This was a city designed, as a whole, by people who thought carefully about how human beings should live together. And the most remarkable thing about these cities, the thing that tells you most about the people who built them, lay beneath the streets and within the houses. Water. These were people obsessed, in the best sense, with water, with cleanliness, with the management of the wet and the dry. The houses had bathing rooms. The cities had drains, covered brick channels running beneath the streets, carrying wastewater away, connected to the houses by smaller channels, an entire hidden system of sanitation built into the very fabric of the city, thousands of years before such things became common again in much of the world. There were wells throughout the city, hundreds of them, so that fresh water was never far from any home. And at the heart of one great city stood a structure we call the Great Bath, a large, carefully sealed, watertight tank, reached by steps, lined with brick, set in a kind of waterproof mortar that seems to have been built for some ritual of bathing or purification. Water made not only useful but sacred, the river's gift raised into ceremony. To walk through Mohenjo-Daro in its prime would have been to walk through a place of order and quiet competence. The houses, built of standardized bricks, all made to the same proportions across the whole vast civilization, a sign of some shared system of measurement and craft. The wells, the drains, the bathing rooms, the granaries where the harvest of the river plain was stored, the workshops where craftspeople made beads and pottery and small carved seals, those famous little seals carved with the images of animals and with the symbols of that script we cannot read. There were no vast palaces that we can identify, no enormous tombs, no obvious monuments to god-kings of the kind that towered over Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Indus cities seem, strangely, more concerned with the comfort and order of ordinary life than with the glory of rulers. And this is part of their mystery, and part of their quiet appeal. A civilization that poured its genius into drains and baths and well-built homes, rather than into pyramids and palaces. And then, over a few centuries, it faded. The great cities were gradually abandoned. The drains fell into disrepair, the streets emptied, the careful order dissolved, and the population drifted away into smaller villages, the urban world dissolving back into the countryside from which it had risen. No invasion fully explains it, no single catastrophe. The likeliest answer, as far as we can tell, lies once again with the river, and with the climate that feeds it. The rivers of the region appear to have shifted their courses over time, as great rivers do, wandering across their plains over centuries. And one major river that had watered part of the civilization seems to have weakened and changed, its waters diminishing. The monsoon rains, on which everything depended, may have grown less reliable, drying gradually over generations, and a civilization built so entirely around the management of water could not survive the slow failure of the water itself. The river that made them, by changing its mind across the slow centuries, unmade them. They left behind their grids and their drains and their unread writing, and they slipped quietly out of memory, so completely that for thousands of years no one even knew they had existed at all. There is a particular sadness in that, and a particular peace as well. A whole world, sophisticated and orderly and humane, can rise beside a river and flourish for centuries, and then dissolve so gently that history forgets it entirely, and the river runs on, indifferent, carrying the same water past the buried streets of the city it once fed. Nothing is lost completely, in the end, for the bricks remain in the earth and the seals remain to be found. But the names are gone, the voices are gone, the meaning of the little symbols is gone, and what remains is a quiet lesson about how much can be built beside moving water, and how quietly it can all return to silence. Let us travel further east still, to the last of the great cradles, to a land where a river earned a name that captures the whole double nature of these waters, better than any other. In the north of China runs a great river that the Chinese call the Huanghe, the Yellow River, and they gave it that name for the color of its water, which is heavy, thick, opaque, golden brown, with the enormous load of fine silt it carries. This silt is a special and remarkable thing. Far upstream, the river runs through a vast region covered in a deep, soft, yellowish soil called loess, a fine dust laid down over countless ages by the wind. And the river cuts through this soft soil and gathers up astonishing quantities of it, until the water itself becomes almost as much earth as water, the most sediment-laden great river on the planet. That silt is the river's gift and the river's curse, and the people of North China lived their whole long history caught between the two. On the one hand, the loess soil, spread by the river across the lowland plains, is wonderfully fertile, soft, and easy to work, and it was on this golden soil that Chinese farming civilization first took deep root, growing millet in the early days, and later the wheat and other grains that fed a growing world. The Yellow River, like every river in our story, laid down the ground on which a civilization could rise. But the very silt that made the soil rich also made the river deadly, for as the river slowed and spread across the flat plain, it dropped its heavy load of sediment onto its own bed, raising that bed higher and higher over the years, until in places the river ran along the top of a great ridge of its own making, higher than the surrounding fields, held in only by the banks, natural and human, that lined it. And a river that runs above the land it flows through is a river that, when it breaks its banks, does not merely flood. It pours out across the countryside in a vast sheet, drowning enormous areas, and sometimes it does not return to its old channel at all, but carves an entirely new one, shifting its mouth by hundreds of miles, abandoning the cities it once fed, and sweeping away the ones that lay in its new path. This is why the Chinese came to call the Yellow River by another name as well, a darker name, China's Sorrow. Over the long course of recorded history, it broke its banks countless times and changed its main course on many occasions, and each such event could mean the drowning of vast territories and the loss of unimaginable numbers of lives. Floods so great, they rank among the deadliest disasters that human beings have ever endured. To live on the Yellow River plain was to live with a sleeping giant, a river that fed you faithfully for a generation, and then, without much warning, rose up and destroyed everything you had built. And out of that hard relationship, that constant struggle to hold the river in its place, grew something deep in the character of Chinese civilization, a long tradition of vast collective effort, of dikes and channels maintained across the centuries, of the understanding that controlling the river required the organized labor of multitudes, directed by a strong central hand. The Chinese tell a story, one of their oldest, about the taming of the floods, and like all such stories, it carries a truth deeper than its details. In the ancient days, they say, the great rivers flooded the land without restraint, and the people suffered. A man was set the task of controlling the waters, and he tried to do it by building dikes and walls, by holding the water back, by force. And he failed, for the water always found a way over or around. Then his son was given the task, a man remembered as Yu the Great, and Yu understood something his father had not. He saw that the water could not simply be blocked, that it must be guided, given a path, led away through channels to the sea. And so, the story says, he labored for many years, dredging the rivers, opening channels, leading the floods gently to where they could do no harm, working so tirelessly that he passed by the door of his own home 3 times without stopping to enter. So devoted was he to the task. And for taming the waters and saving the people, Yu was made a king, and is remembered as the founder of the first dynasty. Whether or not such a man ever truly lived, the story tells you everything about how the Chinese understood their river and their world. The lesson it teaches is that the way to deal with the river is not to fight it, but to understand it, not to block the water, but to give it a path, and that the one who can do this for the people deserves to rule them. The mandate to govern, in the oldest Chinese thinking, was bound up with the duty to control the waters, to keep the dikes sound and the channels clear, so that the river fed the people instead of drowning them. A ruler who let the floods come was a ruler who had lost the favor of heaven. And so here, as in Egypt, you see the river reaching up out of the mud and into the very idea of legitimate power, the river deciding, in a sense, who had the right to rule. To the south of the Yellow River runs another great Chinese river, longer, gentler, warmer, the Yangtze, winding through a wetter, milder land. And here, the gift of the river took a different form, suited to a different crop. In the warm, wet south, where water stood naturally on the land, people learned to grow rice, the grain that thrives with its roots in shallow water, and they learned to flood their fields deliberately, to build the low banks that hold a thin sheet of water across a field of growing rice, the paddies that to this day terrace the hillsides of southern China and much of Asia in shining steppes. Rice, watered by river and rain, fed enormous populations on relatively small areas of land, and the wealth of the South, its rice and its waterways, came in time to balance and even outweigh the older heartland of the North. The 2 rivers, the wild yellow one in the north and the long green one in the south, between them carried Chinese civilization across the ages, one teaching the hard discipline of flood control, the other the patient art of the flooded field. Pause here for a moment, in the quiet, and notice the pattern that has been forming as we wandered. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, The same story keeps repeating itself in different keys. A great river spreads fertile silt across a plain. People gather to farm that silt and learn to guide the water. To guide the water, they must cooperate on a large scale. And to cooperate on a large scale, they must organize. And to organize, they must keep records and appoint leaders and gather surplus. And out of all of that, almost as if it were a natural growth of the riverbank, rises the thing we call civilization, with its cities and its writing and its kings and its gods. It is one of the most striking patterns in all of human history that the first civilizations appeared independently in places that had never heard of one another, and that nearly every one of them appeared beside a great river. The river is not a backdrop to these stories. The river is the cause. But the river was more than a maker of fields and a keeper of cities. It was also, from the very beginning, a road, and this is a part of its gift that is easy to forget in an age of paved highways and aircraft. Before there were good roads, before there were wheels in many places, before any of the machinery of land travel that we take for granted, the easiest way by far to move anything heavy was to float it. A single boat, drifting downstream with the current or pushed along by a sail or a few rowers, could carry a load that would have required a long caravan of struggling porters or animals to move the same distance over land. The river was a highway that built itself, that maintained itself, that asked nothing of those who used it except that they understand its currents and its depths and its moods. Think of what that meant. A city beside a river was not isolated. It was connected, by the water, to everything else along that water, upstream and down. Grain grown in one place could be carried cheaply to feed people in another. Stone quarried in the highlands could be floated down to build temples in the plains. Timber, metal, pottery, wool, ideas, news, all of it moved along the rivers, and the rivers stitched the scattered settlements of a region into a single living network, an economy, a culture, a world. The places where rivers met, the confluences where one river flowed into another, became natural gathering points for trade, and it is no accident that so many great cities of later ages grew up exactly there, at the meeting of waters, where the traffic of two rivers came together and goods could be exchanged and tolls collected and fortunes made. The map of human settlement, even today, is in large part a map of rivers, the cities strung along them like beads on a thread, placed there long ago for reasons that have not entirely faded even now. And we should not pass on without remembering that the river gave food directly, and not only through the grain it grew in the fields. The river itself was full of life, a moving larder that renewed itself endlessly, and the people who lived beside it drew an enormous portion of their sustenance straight from the water. There were fish in great abundance, more than the people could ever take, and they learned 100 ways to catch them, with nets woven from plant fiber, with traps of reeds set in the shallows and the channels, with lines and hooks of bone, with spears in the clear, low water of the dry season. A river in flood brought fish up into the flooded fields and the marshes to spawn, and when the water fell, the fish were trapped in the shrinking pools, and the people gathered them almost without effort, a harvest of the water as reliable as the harvest of the land. Along the banks there were birds in their multitudes, ducks and geese and wading things, rising in clouds from the reeds, snared and netted and brought home for the pot. There were turtles and shellfish in the mud, and the eggs of the river birds in their season, and the soft green plants of the water's edge. For the ordinary people of the river world, much of the protein that built their bodies and fed their children came not from the field, but from the water itself, a quiet, constant, generous gift that asked only patience and a little skill. The river, feeding the people directly, hand to mouth, as it had fed the first wandering bands who came to its banks to drink long before any field was ever planted. There is something deeply restful in imagining that older, simpler abundance, the fisherman at dawn drawing his net up heavy and silver from the brown water, the children gathering eggs among the reeds, the marshes loud with birds, the river giving and giving without ever seeming to grow less. It is easy, when we speak of grand things, of cities and writing and law, to forget the plain daily fact of people fed by moving water. But that fact lay beneath everything else, the broad, quiet base of the whole tall structure, and it never went away. Even in the greatest cities of the river plains, even amid the temples and the granaries and the works of kings, the river still gave its fish and its fowl to anyone with a net and the patience to wait, the oldest gift of all, the one it had been giving since before there were any people to receive it. But a great river is not only a road and a larder, it is also, and this is easy to forget in an age of bridges, a barrier, a wall of moving water that divides the land it runs through, and the difficulty of crossing it shaped the human world as surely as the ease of traveling along it. To get from one bank to the other, in the old days, was no small thing. A wide, deep river could not simply be walked across. There were only certain places, the fords where the water ran shallow enough to wade or to drive a cart through, the narrows where a ferry could carry people over, the firm ground where, much later, a bridge might be built, and these crossing places became points of enormous importance, for everyone traveling across the country, rather than along the river, was funneled toward them. Trade routes converged on the fords, travelers gathered at the ferries, and so, again and again, towns and cities grew up exactly at the crossing places, at the lowest bridge, at the great ford, at the narrows where the two banks could be joined, the very difficulty of the river drawing human life together, at the few points where it could be overcome. Whoever held the crossing held a kind of power, for they held the door between one side of the land and the other, and they could guard it, or tax it, or close it against an enemy. The river that connected everyone who lived along it also divided everyone who needed to cross it, and the places where those two truths met, where the road along the water crossed the road across the water, became, more often than not, the places where the greatest cities of all would one day stand. So much of the shape of the human world, the position of its towns, the lines of its travel, the holding of its power, was written, long ago and almost invisibly, by the simple facts of a river, easy to follow and hard to cross. And because the river was a road, it was also a thing worth controlling. Whoever held the river held the trade. Whoever held a narrow point on the river, a place where the water ran shallow or the banks drew close, could levy a toll on everything that passed, growing rich on the simple fact of position. Whoever held the upstream waters held a quiet power over everyone below, for the river that fed the lower lands flowed first through the upper ones, and water taken or held above could mean thirst and failure below. The control of water and the control of the road that water provided became, very early, sources of power and of conflict, and they have remained so to this very day. For even now, nations argue and sometimes threaten one another over the great rivers they share, over dams and diversions, and the dividing of waters that no border can truly contain. And there is a place where the river's road reaches its end and opens into something even larger, and that place too shaped the human world in ways we rarely consider. For every river, in the end, goes down to the sea, and where the river meets the sea, it makes a special and powerful kind of place. At the mouth of a great river, the trade of an entire continent gathers itself, all the goods that have floated down from the far interior arriving at last at the coast, where they can be loaded onto seagoing ships and carried across the open water to other lands, and where the goods of distant shores can be landed and sent upriver into the heart of the country. The river mouth is a hinge between two worlds, the inland world of the river and the outer world of the sea, and it is no accident that so many of the greatest ports and trading cities of every age have stood exactly there, at the mouths of great rivers, growing rich on the traffic that passed between the river and the ocean. The river that began as a thread of meltwater in distant mountains ends as a gateway to the whole wide world, and along that single continuous road, from the high snows to the open sea, moved much of the commerce and the contact and the slow mingling of peoples out of which the connected world was gradually made. It was along the rivers, too, that the whole great gift of farming itself slowly spread out from the lands where it was born. traveling, as nearly everything traveled, by water. Think of how farming made its long, patient journey into the continent of Europe, for example, over thousands of years. It did not arrive all at once, and it did not spread evenly across the land. It moved, generation by generation, up the river valleys, following the water inland from the warm south, the early farmers settling first in the fertile soils along the banks of the great European rivers, the Danube winding its long way through the heart of the continent, the Rhine running north toward the cold sea, and the many waters that fed them. Up these valleys, the knowledge of grain and herd and field crept slowly northward and westward, the rivers serving as both the road that carried the people and the soil that fed them when they arrived, so that the spread of the settled life across a whole continent followed, like a vine climbing a trellis, the branching pattern of the rivers. And in later ages, when towns and then cities rose across Europe, they rose again and again, on the riverbanks, at the fords and the bridges and the confluences and the navigable reaches, the rivers once more deciding, quietly, where human life would gather and grow. The map of the Old World cities is, very largely, the map of its rivers, drawn long ago by the water and only filled in much later by us. Some thinkers, looking back across all these river civilizations, have proposed a striking idea about the relationship between water and power, and it is worth sitting with for a while, here in the dark, as a kind of thought to turn over slowly. The idea is this: in a land where farming depends on large-scale irrigation, on great works of canals and dikes that no single family or village could ever build or maintain alone, the control of those works becomes the control of life itself. The water is essential, and the management of the water requires the coordinated labor of huge numbers of people, and someone must direct that labor, and whoever directs it holds a power over everyone that is almost absolute, because they hold the water, and the water is everything. And so, the idea goes, these great irrigation societies tended naturally toward strong, centralized, all-powerful states, vast bureaucracies organized around the management of water, in which a ruler at the center commanded the labor of millions through the simple, unanswerable logic that the canals must be dug and the dikes must be held, or everyone will starve. Now, like all grand ideas about history, this one is much debated, and the real picture is surely more tangled and more various than any single theory can capture. For not every river society became a great centralized empire, and the truth was always messier than the pattern. But there is something undeniably suggestive in it, something that helps to explain why so many of the river civilizations developed in similar directions, toward strong central authority, toward record-keeping and bureaucracy, toward the gathering of power at a single point. The river concentrates life along its banks, and concentrating life tends to concentrate power. When everything depends on the management of one shared, essential, dangerous thing, the management of that thing becomes the highest authority in the land. The river, in shaping the fields, also shaped the kind of government that grew up to tend them, and the long human experience of kings and states and bureaucracies has, threaded through it, the silver line of these ancient waters. And here we should pause to remember something that the grand story of kings and gods and great works almost always leaves out, something quiet and enormous and easy to forget. The canals did not dig themselves. The dikes did not raise themselves. The great waterworks that made the river civilizations possible, the channels stretching for miles across the plain, the banks of earth holding back the flood, the reservoirs and the ditches, and the carefully leveled fields, all of it was made by hands, human hands, the hands of countless ordinary people, whose names were never written down and whose lives were never recorded, who labored in the sun and the mud, season after season, lifting the earth basket by basket, clearing the silt that the river dropped into the channels year after year, an endless, patient, exhausting work that never truly finished, because the river was always silting the canals up again, always threatening the banks, always needing to be answered with more labor. Civilization, beside the river, was not only invented, it was dug, it was carried, it was held in place by the muscle and the sweat of generation upon generation of people we will never know, the great anonymous multitude whose ceaseless effort underlay everything, the grain and the cities and the temples and the kings. There is a kind of reverence owed to them, those forgotten diggers and carriers and menders of the banks, the ones who actually did the work that the whole of it rested on. When you picture the pyramids or the ziggurats or the great reservoirs, it is easy to see only the finished marvel and the ruler whose name is attached to it. But behind every such thing stood the patient labor of thousands, ordinary men and women, whose days were spent moving earth and water, whose lives were bound to the maintenance of the channels as surely as the channels were bound to the river. They are the true builders of the river world, and the river world could not have existed without them for a single season, and almost nothing of them remains. No names, no faces, only the works themselves, the canals and the banks now buried in the earth, the silent record of an effort beyond imagining. To think of them, here in the quiet, is to feel the weight and the depth of what it actually took to build a civilization beside the water, and to feel a quiet gratitude toward all those nameless hands, the hidden foundation beneath the whole long story. Yet for all that the river was a thing of practical power, of grain and trade and government, it was never only that to the people who lived beside it. The river was alive to them, in a way it is hard for us, with our pipes and our taps, to fully recover. It was a presence, a being, a god. And of all the ways the rivers shaped the human world, this may be the most intimate, the way they shaped not just our cities and our laws, but our sense of the sacred, our oldest feelings about what is holy and what is to be feared and what is to be loved. Consider how natural it is, when you think about it from inside the ancient world. Here is this thing, this river, that gives you everything. It brings the water without which you would die. It brings the silt that feeds your fields. It carries your boats and connects you to the world. And yet it is utterly beyond your control. It rises when it will and falls when it will. It can drown you in a season or starve you by failing to rise. It is generous, and it is terrible, life-giving and death-dealing, and it answers to no one. What could such a thing be, in a world that had not yet learned to explain the rains far upstream and the snowmelt in distant mountains, but a god, a great living power to be honored and placated, and loved and feared, to kneel at the edge of the water and feel its cool breath and watch its endless passage and know that your whole life depended on its moods, and to call that a god was not superstition. It was a kind of accuracy, an honest naming of the truth, that the river held your life in its hands. And so, across the river civilizations, the waters were sacred. In Egypt, the inundation, the flood itself, was honored as a divine power, a generous spirit who came each year to renew the land, and the people gave thanks for the rising water with festivals and offerings, casting gifts into the river in gratitude for the gift it gave them. In Mesopotamia, as we have seen, the sweet waters had their wise god, the giver of the arts of civilization. And in India, along the great rivers that descend from the high mountains, there grew up a reverence for the river that endures, undiminished, to this very day. The Ganges, above all, the great river of northern India, came to be honored as a goddess, a living mother, her waters held to be purifying, sacred, able to cleanse not only the body, but the soul. To this day, millions come to her banks to bathe in her waters, and to pray, and to commit the ashes of their dead to her current, in the faith that the river will carry them onward, and the love and reverence that flow toward that river have flowed unbroken for thousands of years, one of the longest continuous acts of devotion in all of human history. The river is not, to those who love her, a thing. She is a presence, a mother, a goddess, and in that long devotion you can hear, still living, the oldest human feeling toward the waters that gave us everything. There is something to learn from that reverence, even for those of us who live now in cities of concrete and steel, who turn a tap and think nothing of where the water comes from or where it goes. The ancient feeling that the river was alive, that it was to be honored and not merely used, that it gave and could be angered, that it deserved gratitude, was not foolishness. It was a way of holding in the mind a truth that we, in our convenience, have largely forgotten, that we are utterly dependent on these waters, that they are not infinite and not unbreakable, that the relationship between a people and its river is a kind of bond, with duties on both sides. The old gods of the rivers were, in a way, the personification of that bond, a way of remembering, every single day, that the water mattered, that it was the source of life and must be treated as such. We have lost the gods, most of us, but we might do well to keep the gratitude and the care that the gods stood for. We have walked beside the four great cradles, the rivers where civilization was first born, but they are not the whole of the story, and it would be a poor wandering that did not turn aside to visit a few of the other waters that shaped the human world, the rivers that built civilizations of their own in other times and places, far from the first four. For the pattern we have traced did not happen only once, in only those places. It happened again and again, wherever people gathered beside generous water, all across the world, in lands the first civilizations never knew. Travel in your mind to the southeast of Asia, to the great river called the Mekong, and to a wide flat plain not far from it where, around 1,000 years ago, there flourished one of the most extraordinary water civilizations the world has ever seen. The people we call the Khmer built, on that plain, a vast capital city, Angkor, and around it a network of waterworks so enormous that it can be seen from the sky, great reservoirs called barays, immense rectangular tanks of water, miles long, holding the monsoon rains, fed by canals, distributing water across the land to grow rice in abundance through the dry season as well as the wet. On the wealth that this great hydraulic landscape produced, the Khmer built temples of breathtaking beauty, mountains of carved stone rising out of the jungle, the greatest of them so vast and so magnificent that it remains, even now, among the largest religious monuments ever raised by human hands. And like so many of the others, this water civilization too, after centuries of glory, declined. And the reasons remain debated, but they seem to involve, once again, the water, the great system of reservoirs and canals growing too complex to maintain, the climate swinging between terrible droughts and devastating floods that the system could not handle, the careful management of the water breaking down, the jungle slowly reclaiming the temples and the canals alike. The same story, in a different land, in a different age. The river gives, the people build, the water shifts, the order fails, and the jungle, or the desert, or the silence, returns. Cross now the whole width of the world, to a continent the old civilizations never knew existed, to the great river that runs through the heart of North America, the Mississippi, longest of that continent's waters, gathering the rain of half a continent and carrying it down to the southern sea. Here too, long before any ships arrived from across the ocean, people gathered beside the river and built. Along the Mississippi and its tributaries, there arose a civilization we know far too little about, a people who built great mounds of earth, some of them enormous, flat-topped pyramids of soil rising above the river plains, crowned with temples and the houses of chiefs. The greatest of their cities, which we call Cahokia, stood near where two great rivers meet, and at its height it was a true city, home to many thousands of people, its central mound a vast platform of earth, larger at its base than some of the pyramids of Egypt, the heart of a culture that traded along the rivers across enormous distances, that watched the sky and ordered its life by the seasons, that flourished for centuries. And then it too declined and was abandoned, its people dispersing, the reasons once again uncertain, but likely bound up with climate and resources and the difficulty of feeding a great concentrated population through hard times, and the mounds were left to the grass, so that when newcomers arrived centuries later, they could scarcely believe that the ancestors of the people they met had raised such things. Beside the river, a civilization. Always beside the river. And yet, here is a turn in the story that you were almost certainly never told. a place where the pattern seems, at first, to break. Consider the greatest river of them all, the mightiest river on the entire planet, carrying more water than any other by far, so vast that at its mouth a person standing on one bank cannot see the other, draining a basin the size of a continent. This is the Amazon, in the heart of South America, and for a long time it was held up as the great exception, the giant river that, strangely, never seemed to have cradled a civilization of the old familiar kind. No great stone cities, no pyramids, no famous kings. Only, it was long believed, a thin scattering of small wandering peoples beneath the endless canopy of the rainforest. The river was the largest in the world, and the forest it watered was the richest. And yet, the old story went, here the pattern failed, and no great civilization rose. And there were reasons offered for this. The soil of the rainforest, for all the lushness above it, is in many places surprisingly poor, the nutrients locked up in the living forest rather than the ground, washed away by the endless rain, so that the gift of fertile silt that the other great rivers spread so generously did not translate, in the same way, into easily farmed fields beneath the trees. But the deeper truth, only uncovered in more recent times, is stranger and more wonderful than the old story of emptiness, and it returns the Amazon to its rightful place in our wandering. For it now seems that the great forest was never nearly so empty as it was long believed to be. Hidden beneath the trees, archaeologists have begun to find the traces of something far larger and more sophisticated than anyone imagined. The remains of substantial settlements, of earthworks, and raised fields and long causeways, and the outlines of what may have been towns, woven through the forest along the rivers, holding perhaps far greater numbers of people than the old picture allowed. And most remarkable of all, they have found, in patches across the basin, a strange dark earth, far richer than the poor soil around it, a deep black fertile ground that the forest peoples appear to have made themselves, over long generations, by carefully working charcoal and bone and waste into the soil, transforming the thin, poor earth into something that could feed them, a soil so good that it remains fertile to this day, centuries after the hands that made it fell still. They did not wait for the river to give them rich soil. Where it did not, they made the soil themselves. And so it appears that the people of the great river did, after all, build a kind of civilization along its banks, only one shaped to the forest rather than the desert, a civilization of earth and wood and living things rather than of stone, that left fewer of the hard monuments we are used to looking for, and was, perhaps for that very reason, almost entirely overlooked, until the trees themselves began, slowly, to give up their secret. The pattern did not break beside the greatest river. It only wore a different face, and waited a very long time to be seen. And we cannot leave this wandering without returning, briefly, to the river that ran through the heart of the classical world, the world that shaped so much of what came after in the Western lands, the river Tiber, on whose banks rose the city of Rome. Rome was not born of a great fertile floodplain in the way that the first cities were. It was born, in part, of position, set at a crossing point of the Tiber, where the river could be forded and where the trade of the region naturally converged, a place where roads and water met. And as Rome grew into a vast city, larger than any the Western world had yet seen, it faced the eternal problem of all great cities, the problem of water, of getting enough clean water in and enough foul water out for a population of perhaps 1 million souls. The Romans answered that problem with an engineering genius that still astonishes, building the great aqueducts that carried fresh water from distant hills across valleys, on soaring arches and through tunnels under mountains, delivering it to the fountains and baths and households of the city, and building beneath the city great sewers to carry the waste away to the river. The Romans understood, as the people of the Indus had understood long before, that a great city is in the end a machine for managing water, and that the health and the very possibility of the city depend on getting the water right, the fresh water in and the foul water out, in their proper channels, forever. Now let us draw these threads together, in the quiet, and think about the double face that the river has worn through all of these stories. For it is the deepest truth about the rivers that built civilization, and the one we are least often told. The river is the giver of life and the bringer of death, and it is both at once, with the same water, in the same channel. The flood that drowns the village is the flood that feeds the field. The river that carries your boats is the river that, when it rises, carries away your home. The water that makes the desert bloom carries within it the salt that, over centuries, will turn the bloom to dust. There is no clean separation in the life of a river between the gift and the danger. They are the same thing, seen from different seasons, and the people who lived beside the great rivers knew this in their bones, in a way that we, protected by our dams and our forecasts and our distance from the soil, have largely forgotten. To live beside a river was to accept that bargain, to take the gift knowing the danger came with it, to build your whole world on the back of a thing that could destroy that world in an afternoon. And there is a strange courage in that, and a strange wisdom too. The river civilizations did not have the luxury of safety. They could not move the river, and they could not escape it, for without it they were nothing. And so they learned to live with it, to read it, to honor it, to build for it and against it at the same time. They built their dikes high, and they prayed to their river gods, and they kept their records, and they passed down their knowledge of the water from one generation to the next. The lore of the floods, the timing of the rising, the signs in the sky, and the color of the water, and the smell of the wind, all of it gathered against the day when the river would turn. And when the river did turn, as it always did in the end, they grieved and they rebuilt, and they went on, beside the water, because there was nowhere else to be. Let your mind rest, for a little while, in the slow turning of a single river year, the way it would have felt to live inside that ancient rhythm, for it is a soothing thing to hold, this cycle that turned, the same way, for thousands of years. The year begins, let us say, in the dry season, when the river runs low and clear in its channel, far below the high banks, and the fields lie open and tired after the harvest, the soil cracked, the heat heavy on the land. The people wait. They mend their tools and their boats. They tend their stores of grain. They watch the sky and the water for the first signs of the change to come. And then, in its season, the river begins to rise. Far away, in mountains the people may never have seen, the snows are melting or the great rains are falling, and the water comes down, swelling the river day by day, the level creeping up the marked banks, the current growing stronger, the color deepening with the silt it carries. The people watch it climb with a mixture of hope and fear, for everything depends now on how high it will come and how long it will stay. At its height, the flood spreads out across the low land, and for a time, the ordinary world is transformed. The fields gone beneath a shining sheet of water, the villages become islands, the boats gliding where lately people walked. It is a strange and beautiful season, a season of waiting and of rest, when there is nothing to be done in the drowned fields, and the people turn to other things, to building and to mending and to ceremony, fed by the stores of the year before. And then, slowly, the water begins to fall. It sinks back toward its channel, day by day, and as it withdraws, it uncovers the land again, but a land transformed, glistening, dark, spread with the fresh new silt, soft and rich and ready. Now the work begins in earnest, the hurried, hopeful work of planting, scattering the seed across the wet, warm earth before it can dry, leading the last of the water through the channels to where it is needed, and then the long, patient watching as the green shoots rise and thicken, and the grain forms and ripens in the sun, and at last the harvest, the gathering in, the threshing and the storing, the filling of the granaries against the dry season to come. And then the dry season comes, and the river runs low again, and the great wheel turns once more, as it has turned, and will turn, beyond all counting. To live within that cycle, year upon year, generation upon generation, was to feel one's own small life held within a vast and steady rhythm, the breathing of the river, in and out, flood and ebb, a rhythm older than memory and surer than anything else the world could offer. Which brings us, at the last, to our own age, and to the strange new chapter that we have written in the long story of the rivers, a chapter unlike any that came before. For thousands of years, human beings lived beside the rivers and worked with them and around them and against them, but always, in the end, on the river's terms. The river was larger than any single generation could master. The floods came and could be guided, but never truly stopped. The great waters kept their own counsel. And then, within the span of just the last century or so, a blink in the long life of these rivers, we did something that no people before us had ever managed. We learned, with our machines and our concrete, to truly bind the great rivers, to throw across them dams so vast that they hold back the water of entire flood seasons, that store the river in great artificial lakes and release it as we choose, that turn the wild, unpredictable, godlike rivers of the ancient world into managed channels, controlled and measured and made, at last, to obey. Consider the Nile, that faithful old river whose flood ordered Egyptian life for thousands of years, whose rising was a calendar and a miracle and a god. In the last century, a great dam was raised across it, far to the south, and behind that dam, the river was gathered into an enormous lake, and the ancient flood, the inundation that had renewed the fields of Egypt since before history began, the great heartbeat of that world, was stopped. It does not come anymore. The land below the dam no longer drowns each summer and no longer receives the gift of fresh silt, for the silt now settles in the lake behind the dam instead of spreading across the fields. In exchange, the water can be stored and released at will, and the land can be farmed all year, and the river's power can be turned into light for the cities, and the terrible floods, and the terrible failures of the flood, the years of too much water, and the years of too little, the famines and the disasters, those are largely ended too. It is a bargain, like every bargain the river ever offered, with a gift and a cost bound together, the wild river tamed and made safe and made to serve, but the ancient rhythm broken, the silt no longer coming, the old relationship between the people and the water changed forever, into something new that we are still, even now, learning to understand. And the same has happened, in our age, on rivers all across the world, on the Yellow River and the Yangtze, on the great rivers of the Americas, on the Mekong, on countless others. We have raised our dams and gathered the waters, and turned the rivers to our purposes, for power and for water, and for safety from the floods. And in doing so we have, in a sense, ended the age that began 10,000 years ago beside those first ancient channels, the age in which human life moved to the rhythm of the river's own moods. We have, for the first time in the whole long story, taken the rivers in hand, and whether that is a triumph or a kind of loss, or both at once, in the way of all the river's bargains, is a question that hangs over our own time, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable, for we are too close to it, still living inside the change, to see it clearly. What we can see, lying here in the quiet, and looking back across the whole vast span of it, is how completely the rivers made us, and how little we usually remember it. Almost everything we think of as belonging to civilization, the city and the field, the written word and the counted year, the granary and the temple, the law and the king, and the slow gathering of human beings into the great cooperative enterprise of living together, almost all of it grew up first beside moving water, drawn out of the human possibility by the gift and the demand of the rivers. We did not invent civilization in the abstract and then go looking for somewhere to put it. We grew into it, slowly, over thousands of years, on the banks of the great rivers, shaped by their silt and their floods and their currents and their moods, as surely as the valleys themselves were shaped by the patient cutting of the water. The river is not just the place where it happened. The river is, in a deep sense, the reason it happened at all. And the rivers are still here. That is the quiet wonder to rest in, as we come toward the end of our wandering. The Tigris and the Euphrates still run down across their plain, past the buried ruins of the first cities in the world, past Uruk and Ur and Eridu, lying silent under the dust. The Nile still flows north through its valley of green, past the temples and the tombs, past the vast, patient pyramids, carrying the same water it carried when the pharaohs watched for the star and waited for the flood. The Indus still winds through its land, past the grids and the drains of the cities whose names we will never know. The Yellow River still runs golden with silt across the plain it has flooded 1,000 times. The Ganges still receives the prayers and the love of millions, as she has for as long as anyone can remember. The rivers that built the world are still moving, still carrying their water down from the high places to the low, still doing the same slow work they were doing before there was anyone to watch, before there were any cities, before there was any of this, and they will go on doing it, in all likelihood, long after the cities of our own age have joined the buried cities of the past beneath the silt. There is a great peace in that, I think, a peace worth carrying with you into sleep. The rivers were here before us, and they will be here after us, and for a little while, in the long middle of their endless passage, they gave us everything: the ground beneath our cities, and the water in our fields, and the road for our boats, and the rhythm for our years, and the first faint sense that there might be something holy in the world worth our gratitude. We rose up beside them, out of the mud and the flood and the silt, and we built our whole world on their patient banks, and most of us have forgotten, in the convenience of our days, how much we owe to the moving water. But the water has not forgotten us. It runs on, past our sleeping cities, in the dark, exactly as it ran past the sleeping camps of our distant ancestors. That same soft, endless murmur in the night, that same cool breath off the surface, that same long, patient passage from the mountains to the sea. So as you drift now toward sleep, you might let your mind rest for a moment on the nearest river to wherever you are. The water that runs, perhaps unseen, somewhere not far from you, threading through your land as it has threaded through the lands of every people who ever lived. Picture it moving in the darkness, slow and silver and sure, carrying its silt and its quiet down toward the sea, indifferent and generous, dangerous and giving, exactly as it has always been. And know that you are part of that long story too, one more person living beside the moving water, as people have lived for 10,000 years and more. Your life, like theirs, still resting, in ways you will likely never think about, on the patient gift of the rivers that built the world. And with that, we'll let our journey rest here for the night. If you've found some quiet in this slow wandering through the waters and the ages, you might consider staying with us for more of these unhurried explorations of the earth and its deep past. A like or a subscribe helps these calm journeys find their way to others looking for somewhere peaceful to rest, but only, as always, if it feels right to you. For now, thank you for spending this time here, drifting beside the old rivers. May the water carry your thoughts gently downstream into sleep, and may your own rest tonight be as deep and as easy as the slow passage of a river in the dark.